Participants include James Woolsey, William Webster, James Schlesinger, Richard Helms, and John Deutsch. They talk about their tenures at the CIA and how the agency has changed. The event is about an hour and 10 minutes.
Good evening. Welcome to a very special evening at the Council on Foreign Relations. My name is Les Gelb, and I'm president of the Council. My staff always scripts me very carefully for fear that I'll quickly fall off the reservations. The instructions begin, please follow the suggestions listed below and start the meeting on time. I've already disrupted the orders. We welcome you all, and welcome in particular our special guests for this evening, the group of past directors of Central Intelligence, and a very special group they are. Let me introduce them in the order in which they served, and do it all too briefly because their careers merit biographies, and then quickly go to the program, which I will describe in a moment. All the way over to my right is Richard Helms, who as a young man entered the Navy and the Office of Strategic Services, and then the birthing CIA, and was one of the people who helped carve it into an important institution in American national security. He served as Director of Intelligence from 1966 until 1973. On Dick Helms's left is James Schlesinger. Jim Schlesinger was Director of Central Intelligence in 1973, but as you know, served as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Energy, and Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia. It was all downhill from there. On my right is Judge William Webster, who served as Director of Intelligence from 1987 until 1991, distinguished career as a judge and as Director of the FBI. On my left is Jim Woolsey. He doesn't belong on my left. Jim was Director of Central Intelligence from 1993 to 1995. Before that, he served on the National Security Council staff and was an arms control negotiator. And in his idle time, he now practices law, as does Bill Webster, in the significant idle time that they have. All the way over on my left is John Deutsch, who was Director of Central Intelligence from 1995 to 1996, was also Deputy Secretary of Defense, a high official in the Energy Department, and Provost of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I don't think we can find in any group of senior government officials one more outstanding in dedication and public service than this one. So join me in welcoming them. As you know, Admiral Stansfield Turner, who was Director of Central Intelligence during the Carter administration, had agreed to join us this evening. But tragedy entered his life a few months ago in a plane crash that his wife did not survive and where he suffered punishing injuries himself. I hope he's watching this evening. We will miss him here. We wish him strength and solace, and we dedicate the evening to him. This evening, the idea for this evening came from one of our members, Ken Moscow. Ken was, for 5 years, a very, very active term member and is now a full member of the council. He lives in Boston And he has been after us to gather up you folks because he thought that you were a special clan and that it was important for us to hear from you. Ken is not only responsible for the idea for the evening, but for the generosity of the evening. Would you join me in thanking him? And finally, on the thanks note, every time I come to Washington, I have to thank Paula Dobriansky, our Vice President and Director of Washington Programs, for the simply phenomenal job she has done here these last few years. She's terrific. And this evening's festivities were managed mainly by Dan Fada, Paula's assistant. Dan does a terrific job here, and he put together the evening along with Lorraine Snyder and Amy Drapeau. And would you join me in thanking them? As you looked around the room this evening, you may have noticed a guest, and the guest is C-SPAN. We welcome you to this council event. And you cause us to alter our very lax council rules anyway. Usually we are not for attribution, which means you can take all the good substance of an event away, but you can't say who said it. Tonight, you can say who said it. It's all on the record. And I think increasingly, those kinds of meetings make sense because it gives us an opportunity to reach out to a wider American audience. My staff suggests here that I insert a joke. Let me tell you the joke I tried out this afternoon. I said, never could I recall a gathering of intelligence on intelligence, so formidable as this one since Bob Woodward dined alone. They told me not to tell it. We're not, thank you very much, Dan. Dan sure suggests they were right. We're not going to have speeches this evening. We're going to have a panel discussion for the first 45 minutes and then open it up to questions and answers. And the discussion among the DCIs here will center on 3 questions, which we'll take up one at a time. The first one deals with the quality of our intelligence on terrorism and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. The second will deal with the problems created by the information age. And the third will deal with economics and the capacity of our intelligence services to deal with this new and very important, central, in fact, aspect of international affairs. So I'm going to open it up with question 1, which is really an opportunity for you all to contemplate briefly how we're doing in dealing with intelligence on terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. Is this something where we have more or less peaked our capabilities? Are we doing it well? Can we really improve it? If so, how? An opportunity for you to dwell on that, and if you want to reveal any secrets from your past behavior that might enliven the discussion. Why don't we start with you, Mr. Helms?
I've been away from this job for almost 30 years. And when I was in the position, I was dealing with these same subjects. Maybe not the internet, but things like it. We didn't call them weapons of mass destruction in those days. That's an invention that one of you probably hasn't come by in recent years. In those days, it was what we did about nuclear proliferation. And we had a whole list of those countries that had nuclear bombs, those that did not, those that were on the threshold. We had a whole category of these things. So I can only say that the CIA has been worrying about that problem, as well as terrorism, for all these many years. We'd been worrying about them up to then. We're worrying about them still. And the question before the House is, how well are we doing? I don't know. I just know what I read in the newspapers. But I can say this, that it is going to be mighty difficult to improve and invent new ways to cover these situations just by blandly saying, yes, we can improve it. I mean, that's the normal way in Washington. We made mistakes, but we'll be there. We'll take care of it. The question is, how do you take care of it? Terrorism, for example. One little fella with a couple of bombs in his knapsack can blow up a building. This happens all over the world. When you look at the State Department's report on terrorism for a year, there are hundreds of these little episodes of, if they're not exactly terrorism, except they might just as well be. The question really is, how do we handle our foreign policy in such a way that we don't antagonize half of the world wanting to blow us up? And I think you might think about that just a little bit. We have certain Islamic groups, for example, that want to blow up the United States. Why? Because they feel we've been giving them a hard time. Have we? Do we really look at it from that standpoint? I recall that at a Baltimore Orioles baseball game about 7 years ago, President Clinton came up to me in the box in which I was sitting and asked me to come over and speak to him privately. So I got up and went at the back of the box, and we ended up having his office in the closed closet of the particular box in which I was sitting. He said, I wanted to ask you how we can do a lot about this terrorist question. I said, see that the FBI and the CIA do their job, keep them on it, and they're the best you can get. If you've got anything better, I don't know what it would be. And since that episode, I've been thinking about this myself, and I'm not sure what you would do to improve it. As far as weapons of mass destruction are concerned, ancient espionage, not tactics, but insertions will do that for you. But the problem that the agency has in the public relations way is if India explodes a bomb and it hasn't been in the newspapers 2 days before, the agency has failed. Well, it isn't true. It hasn't failed at all. They knew exactly where the bomb was going to be placed and all the rest of it. The only thing they didn't know was when the trigger would go off. This is tough to exist in an atmosphere like that. So I think I've gone on long enough, but just to tell you that sitting here today, I don't see any great improvement in what's being done already.
Thank you very much. Jim Schlesinger. Jim, you'll need to hold the mic, alas, as you talk. And I'm going to try to hold you each to 2 or 3 minutes on the opening round so that you'll have a chance to talk to each other about this as well.
Are we dropping the third question that was in the script, or are we continuing with the third question, protecting critical infrastructure?
We're going to do that. That will be the second question, the third on economics, Jim.
That's the third part of the first question.
We're on the first question, Jim. I look forward to your response.
Okay. In the first place, it's gotten a lot harder. You've got to pity your successes, particularly your more recent successes, Dick. These are three rather different areas. With regard to detecting weapons of mass destruction, one must remember that weapons of mass destruction is a political term more than a technical term. When we have observables out there, we're pretty good at detecting them. We can detect nuclear weapons, preparations for the development and acquisition of nuclear weapons. We're pretty good at ballistic missiles. When you test them, they're quite easy to observe. Biological and chemical weapons, which we now include under the weapons of mass destruction, we are not very good at because it's very easy to hide the production of chemical weapons. It's fairly easy to hide the production of biological weapons. You can read Ken Alabek's book called, what is it called? Biohazard. And the splendid techniques that the Soviet Union used to fool Western observers in the good old days. The good old days may still be with us. One of the problems, though, is that coalition warfare, which seems to be our favorite, is hell on sources and methods. And the reason that it's hell on sources and methods is that you've got to spread around a lot of information. Back there in the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein was our good friend, we helped him out with intelligence, and he learned a great deal as a consequence about our methods. Subsequently, in the Gulf War and the follow-on with Iraq, the various members of the coalition learned a fair amount about our methods. They learned how to avoid our detecting them. With regard to terrorism, countering the terrorism, terrorists are a little behind narco-traffickers, but they'll catch up with them. It is getting harder and harder. They have cryptological devices now. They use global positioning system to locate where they are putting their little catches. Right now, the terrorists are technologically backward, but over time, as the technology is spread around, they will be in a better position. With regard to protecting the critical infrastructure, it is lucky that the United States has not been assaulted as yet, because we are the most vulnerable country in the world. Critical infrastructure is probably our Achilles heel. Right now, we have a good deal of work going on in this country with regard to protecting critical infrastructure.
Jim, we're going to get to that in the second round. So we'll talk about that in the second round of questions.
I'm just trying to follow this script.
That's what I was afraid of.
Yeah.
But let's, on this first go-round, stick mainly to terrorism and weapons of mass destruction and our capabilities in this area going up, down, how we fix them.
Well, our capabilities are deteriorating because it is there's always a war between offense and defense, and right now those whom we are attempting to penetrate are getting better and better at defensive measures.
Bill?
Jim. There's a certain risk associated with listening to all of us old buffaloes, and that we not fight last year's war in the same way that we do. We need to identify the present problems and the present targets for good intelligence work. In terms of terrorism, I think there have been some significant changes since I first got involved in it 22 years ago, when the Armenians were the main problem in the United States. We haven't heard from them for 10 years. When pipe bombs were the normal method of choice, when everyone took credit, even those who hadn't participated in the event, within minutes after one of them occurred. These things have all changed. The greatest thing that I think, the challenge that confronts intelligence and law enforcement working together on this, is the fact that, as I think Dick Helms pointed out, a few people can do a lot of damage with readily available materials, and the boom is a lot larger and more frightening to the American people and to others around the world. So getting there before the bomb goes off becomes a principal challenge, and we all know the same problem exists. The terrorist can pick his time, his place, his method, and that's pretty difficult unless you have inside information, which occasionally we're able to do. I've always said that someday someone will write the story of how we tracked down and upset Saddam Hussein's teams of terrorists in the Gulf War. That's never been written. But with good tradecraft and good information, it can be done. And that there can be unquestioning dedication in the counterterrorist sections to see that we don't miss the opportunities that are there. You won't always hear about it. The cellular problem makes it difficult. People don't always know the whole story. But it has to go on, and it's important because people are frightened by what they have seen in the last few years. In terms of weapons of mass destruction, The biggest problem, it seems to me, for the intelligence community is to watch to see where these materials, which are supposed to be in safe custody, primarily in Russia, are finding their way into other people's hands and giving them a sense of clout and a willingness to use them, just as Saddam Hussein was willing to use chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War and was busy trying to develop modern methods of nuclear capability and almost succeeded. So intelligence has to focus on what's going on in the world, and security has to focus on how well people are protecting what's there to be protected. There's an old saying that security is always too much. People complain about it until one day it's not enough. The counter argument can be made in terms of terrorism. It's very important to understand the nature of terrorism, what terrorist groups exist out there. You're not going to find the same old state-sponsored terrorists these days. They're well-financed groups of individuals. The bin Laden, for example, have done more damage in the last few years than most of the state-sponsored terrorists who concentrated on kidnapping people and blowing up military installations. Can we do better? Of course we can do better, but we're going to have to rely on a good deal of information and find out how to get information without giving information that tips off those who are engaged in this kind of activity. These are two important areas for the intelligence community, and they have to work very closely with the law enforcement communities around the world to make it happen. So that's where I think we are.
Thank you very much, Bill Webster. Jim Woolsey.
Let's take weapons of mass destruction first. Normally, nuclear, chemical, and bacteriological. Nuclear weapons are an industrial process. It's an industrial process that can be somewhat, that can be hidden and simplified. Saddam hid 4 different ways of making nuclear weapons from both International Atomic Energy Agency inspections and U.S. intelligence in the late 1980s. But at least is a major undertaking and is therefore vulnerable to some extent to being detected by photo reconnaissance satellites, and if there's a lot of communications intercepts and the like. Of course, human intelligence is always extremely useful. Chemical weapons are a somewhat different matter because much of the wherewithal is useful economically and goes into fertilizers and the like. The difference between a fertilizer plant and a chemical weapons plant can be a relatively subtle thing. So there, even if you know that the precursors are in chemicals or in such and such a place, you may well not know whether it's going toward a fertilizer plant or a chemical weapons facility. But again, it's a big industrial process, so reconnaissance satellites, communications intercepts to some extent are useful. Biological weapons, a friend of mine who used to be the deputy head of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency says they're about as hard to do as running a microbrewery attached to a restaurant, and indeed have a lot in common with a microbrewery attached to a restaurant in terms of the types of equipment used and the size. So here, although there are some tricky parts, happily, to biological weapons, and so some of the terrorist groups have had a hard time manufacturing them, it's not and need not be a large industrial undertaking, and consequently much of what you find out is likely to be through defectors or through espionage. Terrorism, in my judgment, is very, very heavily a matter which you're going to learn about through espionage. Through recruiting agents inside terrorist organizations and in the institutions that support terrorist organizations. Terrorism is not a capital-intensive industrial matter. And as a result, I think one needs to look, and we can come back to this if you want, at some of the barnacles that have built up over the years, some of this in my time, some before me, some after me, on the limitations, barnacles on the ability of the ship of the CIA to sail smoothly, limitations on the ability to recruit agents, assets inside terrorist organizations. Some of these deal with the necessity for very detailed crimes reporting to the Department of Justice. If one is going to recruit an agent, a spy, inside a terrorist organization, and that person might have, someone who knows something about a terrorist organization, let's say a European businessman who may have given some money to one has to inquire, first of all, whether or not that individual might have violated some American law in the past, and not just laws like murder, but laws like, say, insider trading, because one needs to get a declination letter from the Department of Justice that that individual is not going to be prosecuted before one can recruit him as a spy. That's something of a barnacle. It may be a barnacle we want to have for good and sufficient reason, tended to come about as a result of the BCCI matter and the like, but it's nonetheless something that slows things up. And by the same token, if that potential spy has been involved in bad actions abroad, whether really serious ones or even some cases minor ones, that needs to get cleared sometimes at very senior levels of the CIA back in Washington rather than being decided in the fields. These are some of the types of policy issues that come up when you're trying to look at how to get better intelligence on both weapons of mass destruction and on terrorist groups.
Thank you, Jim Woolsey. John Deutsch.
Well, I remember when Khobar Towers occurred. The question was, how should we respond to this act of catastrophic terrorism, where U.S. servicemen had been killed and a bomb exploded in Saudi Arabia where they were billeted. And there was a moment of decision between whether you treated this as a matter for Bill Perry, the then Secretary of Defense, to speak with his counterpart, Prince Sultan, the Minister of Defense, or whether you treated it as a law enforcement purpose and asked Louis Freeh to deal with his counterpart, the Minister of Interior. I think that there is, in the matter of dealing with terrorism, an essential issue that we have to face as a nation, and that is whether it's a national security problem or whether it is a law enforcement problem. That distinction, which has served us so well for half a century, grew up in a different world, in a world where the difference between domestic and international was cleaner, where the difference between foreign threats and domestic threats were cleaner, where things like the internet didn't exist, and where the difference between peacetime and wartime were at least able to be anticipated. So the point I would like to make is, as we consider how we should improve our performance of these subjects, I'm particularly addressing catastrophic terrorism, I think we have to go back and ask whether the fundamental policy instruments that we have in place, put there 50 years ago to deal with a very different world technologically, a very different world from the point of view of security, a very different world from the point of view of the Cold War, whether those policy instruments are properly aligned. And I, frankly speaking, don't think that they are properly aligned for this new character of catastrophic threats that we face. Fortunately, my time is up, and I do not have to offer an architecture of a solution. But underlying the issue here is I don't think it can stop by saying good cooperation between these different agencies, such as the FBI and the intelligence community. We have to ask, are we aligning our policy instruments to this new set of threats? And I suggest to you that that is a subject that deserves to be examined. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Try to add this up for us, gentlemen. Are we in a situation, did I hear you right, to say that, in effect, we may be able to hold our own in tracking developments in weapons of mass destruction? Not bad on the nuclear area.
Some weapons of mass destruction.
On some weapons, but more or less hold our own. And on the terrorism side, that it's going to become increasingly difficult for us to track them and have reliable information. Is that sort of where you come out in this?
Well, it's a lot harder. Jim Woolsey made a very important point that if we're serious about terrorism, if we're serious about narcotic gangs, that we've got to be less serious about American law. Most people who join terrorist organizations are not very sensitive about human rights. And if that's going to be a barrier to recruiting them, we are going to get many fewer recruits than we should otherwise have. Now, that is a critical element. It's a question of the degree to which we sacrifice our domestic aspirations in order to improve our capability of dealing with these external threats.
Jim, I'm not sure that I totally disagree with you, but I'd like to make a distinction between American law, on which there can be no question that the intelligence community must comply with American law. Change the law if necessary, but must comply. The regulations that Jim Woolsey were talking about are handed down by departmental heads or by the president. And those can get to be real barnacles and are not required under our Constitution or under the laws that are there. So I'd say that that's the place to address it, rather than say we have a license to play in an arena without reference to American law. And I know you didn't intend that, but that's the distinction, that people covering their own concerns make it more difficult for intelligence officers to operate abroad. But it's not the law, and it's not the Constitution.
Let me just echo one point of what Bill said. We're not talking here about violating or promoting the violation of American law, and certainly not about spying on Americans. We're talking about whether it is appropriate to recruit foreign individuals as spies who might have broken American laws in the past, or who might have done something else bad even if it didn't violate American law. And the problem with having a lot of restrictions like that, certainly some are probably understandable. For example, you don't want to recruit murderers to smuggle guns for you to execute a coup, because they might steal the guns and go murder somebody, all right? But if you're talking about trying to get information, if you're talking about spying as distinct from covert action, trying to take action abroad, it does seem to me that there should be very, very few restrictions upon the individuals, the foreign individuals that one can recruit in order to obtain information. Otherwise, you run the risk of running spies in Beirut who can tell you a lot about what's going on in, say, the churches and the Chamber of Commerce, but you don't have anybody inside the terrorist organizations, because they're all human rights violators. You got to be a human rights violator to want to be in one of those organizations.
I think that there is an extremely important point here. If we're going to be successful as a nation with our friends at fighting terrorism, we are going to have to rely very heavily on human intelligence, and therefore we're going to have to rely on dealing with very bad people. There are very few Thomas Jeffersons in these organizations. The question is whether you undertake getting into relationships with these prospective agents, your case officers out there in the field, whether you do that without making a balanced judgment about their likely value and the liabilities they represent, or not. And my issue is, do these barnacles that Jim Woolsey correctly points to lead to risk aversion in that process? Or do they actually lead to something which protects case officers and permits them to take the kinds of risks that are necessary to gain valuable information? In my view, these barnacles should be looked at partially as a way of protecting case officers from getting in trouble later on.
Last word on this subject to Jim Woolsey, then we'll move on.
John has a point, but let me say this way. If you take the oldest recorded case of espionage in written history that I know of, it was when Joshua sent 2 case officers into Jericho, and they recruited as an agent what the King James Version colorfully calls Rahab the harlot. She ran a safe house for them. She organized their exfiltration on a basket going down outside the wall of Jericho, developed a communications plan so that when the Israelites came back, they'd preserve her family. She was really a very professional agent. Now, if under the current U.S. government rules, Joshua's 2 case officers had to apply those rules, say, for the Israelites in recruiting Rahab, you had 2 problems. First of all, let's say Joshua and I sent case officers Webster and Helms out into Jericho, and they wanted to establish this safe house. First of all, they have to ask the question, did Rahab ever stray out into the desert and practice her profession anywhere among the Israelites? If so, she probably violated Israelite law. And if they paid her anything, I mean for the espionage, I'm sure we're talking about the espionage. If they paid her anything there in Jericho, under the current rules, she becomes an Israelite employee. And therefore, any violation of law, of Israelite law, could require them to go to the Israelite Department of Justice and get a declination letter that she wouldn't be prosecuted before she could set up the safe house for them, okay? The other problem is if she had done anything bad, even under Jericho law, perhaps not just prostitution, but let's say perhaps a robbery connected with the prostitution, all right? That probably rises to the level under current American procedures, such that my two case officers here would have had to come back to me outside Jericho and get approval at a very senior level before they could recruit her, all right? Now, these procedures build up over time, and each one of them is adopted usually at the time for good and sufficient reasons. Some of the most restrictive ones came out of the BCCI scandal, for example. But there comes a time when you have to step back and look at the whole process and say, does this ship have too many barnacles on it? Do we need to scrape some of them off in order to be able to recruit spies in a more effective way?
Thank you, Jim. He advertised that as a short story. Rahab nowadays would be known as an investment banker.
I got to touch that.
Let's go to the second question, the second issue that Jim wanted to get to 15 minutes ago, and that is the question of the information age and its effects on the collection of intelligence and on the protection of our own information. Jim, why don't I let you pick up where you started to go a few moments ago?
Well, as I indicated, there is always a struggle between the offense and the defense, and it is going to get harder and harder to penetrate on the part of the intelligence community. The others out there will be having the advantage of good cryptology. They will be being able to get good satellite intelligence that will be for sale at this juncture. They will be able to use the global positioning system signals. And you run down a whole list of things. For nations, they will have fiber optics, which are much more difficult to penetrate. And all in all, the information age is a disaster from the standpoint of the United States, because we are more vulnerable to attack. Those attacks can be made anonymously, and they can be made, attacks can be made from abroad. So in the struggle between offense and defense, the advantages are going to the offense on the other side. It will become harder and harder to have the good defense. Cy Hirsch wrote an article in December in the New Yorker. It was a pretty good article. It described the growing difficulties for the United States in conducting signals intelligence.
Well, I agree with Jim. I think that this is the area that troubles me the most in coming to grips with something, because of the rapid, enormous changes that have taken place in the technology and in the capacity of our targets, our adversaries, to bring modern equipment, modern technology against us in ways that we would not have dreamed possible years ago. There was a time, I think, when the intelligence community and others were light years ahead of the off-the-shelf manufacturers in commercial life. That's not true anymore. The technology is out there in the private sector. The digital technology is out there, and the ability to confound intelligence gatherers, regardless of how many court orders they had for electronic surveillance, to actually make it happen in the face of available defenses. What troubles me the most, I think, is how we're going to rationalize this, because the intelligence community clearly now views its role as linking up with, and it must, the enormous amount of intelligence that's out there in the internet and in private areas that can contribute to a greater understanding. And after all, that's a good part of our mission, is to reduce the areas of uncertainty so that our policymakers can make wise decisions for our country. This enormous flood of intelligence is out there, and they have to link in. when they link in, they're exposing their own resources to risks and vulnerabilities. The same is true when private sector people are working on classified information and are out there developing a product. They too are vulnerable to this type of attack, and we don't fully understand it. We're only just beginning to realize, that is the general public and those who are trying to confront this problem, that often our outreach into the world of the internet exposes us then through the cookie cutters, the cookies that are left behind, to finding out about us and about looking at our inventory and our directory. And until we really focus hard on this issue, we're not going to get the kind of safe connectivity. I hate the word, but it's the word of choice today. Connectivity between the intelligence protected, so-called protected and classified things, and the non-classified material that's out there in the public arena. Jim mentioned the infrastructures. I worry most about those because the infrastructure runs on electricity, on technology, on electronics, and purposeful attacks on our infrastructure are not only possible, but I believe likely in the future. We worried about Y2K. A good deal of work eliminated, brought that risk down, and we didn't have it. Those were unintended consequences. What we have not focused on are intended consequences, perhaps hiding behind unintended consequences, so that damage can be done to data, to signals, our water supply, a whole range of things, without our knowing where it's coming from. That, I think, is a great national security threat, and one we are not yet on top of. We're a long way from on top of, and it's going to take a lot more work to be comfortable about it.
But it goes beyond the government problem. The greatest vulnerabilities of the infrastructure are in the private sector. And the motivation, the incentives for those in the private sector to make the investments, the heavy investments for protection, just isn't there. Meanwhile, if you read Chinese military literature, they are worried about how it is that they are going to deal with a superior military power, namely the United States. And they concentrate on information warfare and the special vulnerabilities of the United States.
All you do to the United States is turn off the electricity. Then no computers, no connectivity, no nothing. No toilets even. Think of New York City. If you were to bomb the electricity supply and do it successfully, there is nothing that would happen in New York. And think how long it would take to put the thing back together again. And the people that live in those high apartments and so forth. It shakes you up the more you think about it. And yet I don't know anybody that's got their hand on it any more than Jim does.
That's why we New Yorkers prefer the initial attack take place in Washington, D.C. John, how do you add this up? Do you see us as stronger in some respects from the information age, but overall more vulnerable, more in a situation as Jim Schlesinger described, where offense beats defense?
I read a terrific book once of the history of the French intelligence service and their attitudes in France, which occurred when the telegraph was introduced. And all those people who were steaming open envelopes in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said, this is the end of the world. The data rate's gone up in such a way we'll never be able to find the needle in the haystack. The information is everywhere. It's going to lead to democracy or not democracy, depending upon what attitude. The fact of the matter is that I believe that the information revolution, if you like, is neutral with respect to what it does for intelligence. It makes the job harder in some cases, and it makes the job easier in other cases. If I may offer one different view on it, one question is to ask, what does that information revolution, what are the implications for the way we conduct intelligence, in particular technical intelligence? I go back to the theme that I tried to introduce in my earlier comment. 50 years ago, when we introduced technical intelligence, the whole issue was collecting information, whether it was airborne or satellite platforms, taking pictures, collecting. It was The whole issue was collection. Well, today, that problem has been successfully conquered, and the issue now becomes information processing, exploiting the information, and then distributing it to the users, whether it's the national level or at the military level, and putting together maps and pictures and signals in a way that helps you reach your political or your military objective. And that challenge of using this information revolution to make technical intelligence serve users' needs more is a tremendously important technical challenge. And frankly, I don't think we are well configured with that historic separation between the community and the Defense Department, well configured to carry out that process of exploiting, distributing, and analyzing information in contrast to collecting it. And that's where I think there's an important implication.
3 quick points. I think, first of all, for almost all countries in the world, not just the United States, the collection of imagery night and day of what's going on the surface of the globe is easy and getting easier. You can now, for a few $100s with a credit card on the internet, get 1-meter imagery, which is very good imagery, of virtually any place on Earth. And more companies are going to be providing this, and they're going to be providing it to countries and companies all over the world. So if you really want to hide something that's being undertaken industrially and the like, you need to dig. Unfortunately, for intelligence collection, digging's getting a lot easier. Putting even major, huge facilities underground is getting to be a lot easier than it used to be. With respect to information technology, my own judgment is that time is on the side of the defense and on protection. Improvements in widely available cryptology, improvements, I think, are coming in being able to defend computer networks and the like against hacking and denial of service attacks such as the ones we saw a few weeks ago, and even some types of intrusive and instructive viruses. It's not here yet, but there are a lot of very smart people working hard on this. I think that is coming. What is a real danger, I think, is the interrelated relationship of the various networks of the sort that Dick Helms was referring to. If you look back to, I think it was 1967, the blackout in New York, it lasted just a little more than a day. By the time the blackout was over, the electrical blackout, almost all of the emergency vehicles were out of fuel because the fuel pumps were electric. So the ambulances weren't running, the fire department wasn't running engines, and the police cars weren't running. Most people don't think if you shut down electricity for a day or so, you're going to lose all your emergency services. Hopefully now someone's thought to add diesel generators or some kind of backup generators for those systems to pump fuel. But those are some of the types of unexpected interrelationships, and there are a lot of them out there, that can occur if one major part of the infrastructure goes down from a terrorist attack or otherwise, and thereby affects a lot of the others.
One of the areas of real concern that I detect and confirm in talking to those who have the responsibility to dealing with this enormously, rapidly changing technological world is that we are no longer getting the very best and the very brightest coming into the services in this area. Why? Well, there are a lot of obvious answers. One, it's very difficult to compete with the kinds of compensation, the kinds of opportunities, the kind of stock ownership and others that are available in the private sector. For some reason, the devotion to country and loyalty still plays a big role in the services, but we are not seeing the kind of people that we need to get the edge on the competition coming in. And I'd say that that's an area that needs attention. These people are worth the kind of compensation and opportunities that they can get in the private sector. We ought to find the same or alternative methods that will make them come, as they always have in the past, to serve their country and to protect their fellow citizens.
Thank you, Bill. Last word on this subject to Jim Schlesinger.
Well, following up what Bill just said, the society has changed a great deal, and a good deal of abuse is dumped upon those who are serving in the intelligence community. That is a very poor way to recruit. And after World War II, we could draw upon a great wave of patriotism in recruitment. It is getting very hard indeed under present circumstances. The basic problem that we have in this area is the vulnerability of the civilian economy, and we have not been able to generate the kind of reactions on the part of corporate enterprise that is necessary if we are to protect the critical infrastructure. The fact is that they are primarily concerned about hackers, they're concerned about fraud, they are not concerned about the possibility of a massive attack on the United States. Some years ago, NSA conducted an experiment called Eligible Receiver, in which they hypothetically turned off the power on the east coast of the United States. The effect of that would be substantially to reduce the willingness of the American public to engage in some specific foreign intervention.
Thank you, Jim. Last issue before we open up the floor, and since we are pressed for time, I beg your indulgence for brief responses, and I hope we'll get to the subject again in the questions. The issue is economics and the importance of economics today in intelligence. And let me begin with Dick Helms and ask, do we have historical amnesia? Was economics not an important matter for intelligence when you were running the agency? Is it really very, very different from what our past concerns used to be?
I don't know why it should be any different now. And I don't remember that we had any difficulty handling economic intelligence, particularly that type which came from finding out what the opposition were going to do in some peace negotiations or economic negotiations. On several occasions with the Japanese, for example, we came and laid before the American team their whole arrangement, their backup positions, and all the rest of it. Very successful. There was quite a bit of that in that time. Now, what I understand to be the problem is General Motors versus the United States government. Whether you take care of General Motors, whether you don't take care of General Motors. I don't know that's
I mean, whether you share information, the government shares information with them.
With them. And in what order? After first or second? And I don't know that it's ever been resolved.
All right.
On this issue, at least in the last number of years, basically the United States does not conduct industrial espionage. We don't go try to steal Toyota's plans for the next model and give them to General Motors. That way lies madness. Not only would would one get very tangled up in what companies are to be benefited and what not, but most people who are willing to risk their lives and careers and so forth aren't really interested in spying for private American business, and they don't do it. What does happen is that one collects intelligence on things like chemicals that can be used for dual purposes, or supercomputers, or different types of dual-use technologies that can be used either for hostilities or for commerce, and that gets you involved in economic intelligence. Or you collect intelligence on the economics of countries that are under sanctions, and that gets you involved in economic intelligence. Or you connect intelligence on bribery by some of our friends abroad who like to win contracts through bribery, and then you tell the U.S. government so they can try to get the other government not to award the contract on the basis of bribery, but you don't go to the American corporation and say, hey, you're about to lose because some of our friends are bribing the president of the country in question. So I think there are things we do in the economics area, but at least in recent times, it has not been taking secrets from private corporations and giving them to the American companies.
John, do you see the situation differently than Dick Helms described? You think economics does now play a much more central role in the intelligence function?
The question is, how capable is a government agency to do serious economic analysis on a region or on a nation? Most of that analysis, in my judgment, which is important, the relationship between economics and security, is really based on open sources. Yes, it can be helped by clandestine information, but it requires an understanding of the interrelationship between politics and economics, which I think is also very difficult to assemble in the intelligence community. I fully agree with what Jim said about not getting yourself into try to predict short-term interest rates or try to help American companies get industrial advantage. There does lie madness. There is a counterintelligence role to play. But we can't compete in the intelligence community with, and I say this in a friendly way, with banks, with academic economists, with people who study this all the time. We can't compete, and we shouldn't try to compete. That's a skill which can lie outside the community. There is a very important area of interrelating economics and politics, and there I think we don't do as good a job as we should. It is very, very important, and it takes thought. It does not take lots of gadgets and tricks. It takes thought, and I don't think we're as good at it as we should be.
I think there's a general feeling among the members of the community that we're not as good at this as we should be, a recognition of that. There is a strong political component of intelligence gathering that's very good in terms of assessing what kinds of actions political leaders are apt to take in distressful situations, including economic distress. We haven't quite figured out how to manage all of that information that's out there in the private sector to give our analysts a better hook on when we're going to see a major crisis, such as the financial crisis in the Far East that created violence and rocked a good part of the world. More attention needs to be given in that area. I have always felt, simplistically perhaps, that behind every political or military decision is an economic reason. And if you have only to look at the period when Gorbachev was engaging in unilateral disarmament and moving his troops behind the Urals in an effort to convince the United States that he was not a threat and we didn't need to engage in SDI-type competition, which he knew the Soviet Union could not handle. So in staying on top of those crises or identifying countries who lack something and they want it, like slant oil drilling in Kuwait, for instance, we give ourselves a little bit of lead time to our political analysts who can take that information and try to factor it into the kind of military leader or despot or whoever we're looking at to see what, in those situations, we might anticipate would happen. So we do need more of it. It's available out there. It's a question of managing it and better link up with our political intelligence capability and analysis.
Thank you, Bill. Jim, would you add this up for us?
The intelligence community suffers from severe handicaps in this area. If one looks at the question of an international financial crisis, it's obvious, I think, that the International Monetary Fund has far better intelligence. Some of it does not surface, and perhaps the intelligence community could do a better job in that area. Secondly, because of the requirement that the United States government not favor particular competitors, that we do not get into the business of picking up information about foreign industrial processes to be passed on to our own people. Other nations are not so inhibited, but we are.
Thank you very much. The floor is now open for questions. Usual procedure. I'll recognize you. Wait for the microphone to reach you. Please stand. Identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and state your question with the usual precision and brilliance known to Council on Foreign Relations members. Floor is open. All the way in the back here on the left. Please wait for the microphone and then identify yourself. Brief questions.
Thank you. I'm Pat Holt, and at the time of which I'm going to speak, I was on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And I'm talking about 1969 to at least 1973. I recently read in a book based on CIA documents that were smuggled out by a defector to the British and have now been published, that in that period, the KGB had a bug in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. This came as a total surprise to me, and I'm somewhat skeptical about it. But the question is, do any of you, and particularly Dick Helms, who was in charge then, know about this?
Dick, what about the CIA bug and the foreign...
Obviously not. Or I would have done something about it. But my information later was that
Dick, hold the microphone to your...
my information later was that this was not the only bug in there, that when they went in again to sweep the room, they found another one that hadn't been discovered. And the question was, who planted that one?
Pat, if I'm...
Where's the FBI?
Were the people sweeping it looking for bugs or leaving them?
Well, wait a second. Only one question and comment to a customer, Pat.
Pat, I was general counsel of the Senate Armed Services Committee for 3 of those 4 years, and based on the history of those times, I would say we probably successfully, by somebody, the KGB presumably, bugging the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so confused their decision-making process in Moscow as to have been a major American counterintelligence coup.
Any more questions of a similar historical nature?
Just a second. Lately, the Department of State has been bugged, I should point out.
That's true.
Lately.
Very lately.
What's new?
All the way in front, please.
Dan Shaw, National Public Radio. I've been...
Dan, will you hold the mic closer to yourself?
I don't know how to use a mic. I've been listening with sympathy to the frustration that DCIs tend to feel when they find that regulations and red tape hinder them in doing the Lord's work and doing the work of the nation. Is it not possible, though, in the way, for example, that when it was necessary for the CIA to conduct wiretaps or the FBI, that a special court was created to which you could go and ask for an exception from the anti-wiretap statutes? Do we not have the wit to make it possible for intelligence officers to do intelligence work without risking doing something illegal? Is there not a structure that can be devised for that?
Dan, I'm the one who was the main complainant here, so let me say this. Again, we are not talking about needing to violate American law or the American Constitution. We're not talking about spying on Americans, and we're not talking about breaking any American laws at all. What we're talking about is whether it is relatively easy or extremely difficult to recruit foreign individuals to spy who have done bad things in the past in their lives, perhaps in violation of American law, perhaps in violation of foreign law. And what I'm saying is that we have so added restrictions of this sort, we have made it much more difficult than I think it should be for us to recruit people inside places like terrorist organizations and companies that proliferate weapons of mass destruction and the like. Because when you recruit inside those organizations, you have got to recruit essentially people who have done very bad things in the past. And to the degree that you add the bureaucratic layers necessary to have checks and checks and checks and checks on this, you restrict your ability to learn what's going on inside terrorist groups. You don't make it impossible, you just make it a lot harder.
Dan, I really believe that if we looked at some of these barnacles that Jim has described, we'd find they weren't necessary, or they were too extensive, and they ought to be changed. And they could be changed by executive order or by administrative order rather than having to go to the Congress. That was the problem why we created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court that you described, because the Attorney General and those around him were so fearful that if he exercised on behalf of the President the inherent power to protect the national security, somebody would sue them. So they built all these restrictions on the people who had to gather the information. when we were beginning to have trouble with Noriega. The House Oversight Committee or the Senate Oversight Committee, I don't recall which, wrote a letter demanding that Colin Powell and I, in writing, agree to notify Noriega if we ever discovered a plot on his life. Well, along came the problems that you're well aware of, and I informed the president we had this restriction, and he wrote a letter up there saying that commitment is rescinded, and nobody up there could remember ever having asked for it. It's just common sense to have a policing mechanism to look at the sensibility, common sense restrictions, and see whether these are good restrictions or not. One of the Bolin Act amendments, we couldn't go, we had to bring people back 15 miles from the border before we could carry out our covert act responsibilities in the Contra cases. And it builds up, but if there's enough heat brought on those responsible, take responsibility and let the agents do what they're supposed to do within the laws, and don't add these nonsensical restrictions to them.
We may have the wit to devise intelligent methods following common sense to distinguish between good and bad activities, but we have not the ability to prevent retrospective criticism of those common sense decisions.
We're down to our last 5 minutes, only an opportunity, alas, at this session for a couple more questions. There's one over here, please.
Zygmunt Nagorski, Center for International Leadership. Les, you ask for historical questions.
You have that was a joke.
Well, it was
Please
a poor
go ahead,
joke.
Zig.
If it was a poor joke, I pick it up on it. You ask for historical. I have a case after this broad spectrum which you gave us on intelligence work. I have a specific case which came back from Korean War before any one of you have been in the job. In the early 50s, intelligence community pick up indication that a number of American POWs have been shipped by North Koreans to the Soviet Union. This was confirmed later. Today, there is a book coming out on the subject. There is a video commentary and a video cassette.
Please, questions, Zig.
The question is, how many of you have heard about it? Is there any indication that any of those people who were shipped to the Soviet Union are still alive? And how many of you have heard that this was confirmed and could be documented today?
Will one of you just take that, please? That was Zig Nagorski.
I think that we've all heard about the shipment. I doubt that any of them are alive, but we don't know.
Question all the way back here. Please. There's a hand up right back there.
Michael Gillette, Ecocom USA. We provide connectivity, voice, and internet between Eastern Europe and the United States through Western Europe. My question is this. Vladimir Putin, also known as Stasi Putin by those insiders in the KGB and elsewhere in the Russian Federation, is likely to come to the presidency of the Russian Federation and may well be accompanied by a great number of his former colleagues. Question to all DCIs, especially those who served post the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Is this a challenge and a threat for the United States, or an opportunity for close collaboration with people who, by virtue of their internal and external policies, may have created the same kind of problems we have?
Well, we're not going to disparage a professional colleague.
The members of the KGB were the top flight students in the Soviet Union, and it was manned by the best intelligence they had in the whole country. Now, whether that's going to be used against us or with us or behind us, I have no idea, but it isn't because they're second rate.
I would commend to you the recent book by Matrokin and Alexander, The Sword and the Shield, on the real history of the KGB. Matrokin really was the archivist, and there's a lot in there. And I think the bottom line is that the KGB's role in Soviet and the SVR and the domestic intelligence role in Russia still is far more one of focused on suppressing dissidents, infiltrating the Russian church, and all the rest. than most people understood up until very recently. So, although I agree about the intelligence and ability and the fact that the KGB generally was the creme de la creme in terms of intellectual ability and the like in Soviet society, nonetheless, one has to, I think, put a very big footnote beside the names of those who served in that institution. And there are going to be some, Edward Shevardnadze is one, whom I would say has become a superb president of Georgia and a magnificent statesman. It's not impossible. But I think people need to put a footnote there and watch very closely, and I, at least at this point, am rather skeptical about Mr. Putin.
Thank you. We've reached the witching hour, and while we always begin council meetings late, our golden rule is we actually end them on time. This is on time. About 100 of you have confirmed places at the dinner immediately following this event. It's at the Brookings Auditorium, and we will reconvene there as quickly as possible. So if you have a confirmed place, please go to the Brookings Auditorium right off. I want to thank our panel because they took incredibly complicated subjects and spoke to them with precision and good information and good common sense, a rarity in our business. Join me in thanking them.
Our look at the CIA will continue in the morning during Washington Journal. Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Richard Shelby will discuss security in the agency. His committee held closed-door hearings on security and the actions by former Director John Deutsch. Washington Journal begins at 7 a.m. Eastern.